please use the steps. I'm hoping you've all signed in this evening. If you haven't, you won't know you're burning in the building. Next step, please make sure you sign in if you haven't already. If you have a hearing aid, if you have to sign up somewhere, you can switch it to Loop T. That should make your audio experience more pleasurable. I think that's probably about all for housekeeping. We are trying to record the series again this evening. Last month we didn't go quite to plan, but hopefully we'll have a recording going online. So if you've missed out on any of our talks over the last, 3 or 4 months, they are all online for you to view during leisure. So the talk this evening. Well, with Titanic mania sweeping Southampton this month in memory of the 100th anniversary of its demise, Helen will provide a whirlwind tour of the development of seafaring and maritime activity, from its origins in the Pleistocene and our ancestors' first open water crossings to the cutting-edge technology that maritime archaeologists deploy today. The technological development and the symbolic role of the ship within society will be explored alongside the developing discipline and challenges of maritime archaeology. And our speaker this evening is Helen Farr, who is currently a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow within the Centre for Marine Archaeology at Southampton University. She's an in-house speaker. And her research interests include ancient seafaring, island colonization, prehistoric submerged landscapes, and the dynamic relationship between people and their changing environments as sea levels rose during Holocene. Combining skills in marine archaeology, palaeoevnvironmental analysis, and geoarchaeology, Helen has projects in the Solent, and slightly more tropical times, Central Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. So, Helen is on the editorial board for the Journal of Maritime Archaeology, where she's also a review editor, an HSC commercial guide, and a keen sailor. So, very much everything. So, without any further ado, Helen.
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. I'm just going to check. Can everybody hear me? The microphone's pointing in the right direction. Yes? Yep. Okay, that's great. I realised by listening back to my short abstract there that I've actually set myself a massive task. Amongst telling you what maritime archaeology is, tying it to why we're celebrating or commemorating 100 years of the Titanic anniversary, I also am going to touch on around 800,000 years of seafaring history. That's quite a lot to do in 45 minutes. So I guess I'd better get started. So I'm surprised as well that I've been invited to talk today because I think I'm the first maritime archaeologist that's given one of these marine life talks. But actually it fits very well to the subject area because actually maritime archaeology is the study of human activity and material culture not only at shipwrecks, but all the stories of past people's lives on and around the water, living on the coast, looking at dynamic landscapes undergoing sea level rise and changing environmental conditions, population migrations and island colonizations, trade and exchange routes, the origins of fishing, travel, navigation and exploration, and also, obviously, seafaring and global travel, and the technological developments that go with it. The list actually is quite frankly endless, and it's very multidisciplinary, so I hope you'll all find something of interest within this talk. Incidentally, the life of an archaeologist is also an aquatic one, hence the use of this film title, Living the Life Aquatic, today. As such, today, I really want to give you a very broad taste of the development of human relationships with the sea, and in so doing, I hope you're going to get a glimpse of the maritime life that is maritime archaeology. Now, I've already mentioned shipwrecks, but of course, actually, when we're talking about maritime archaeology and underwater archaeology, it's synonymous with what shipwrecks are. And most people would imagine that this is what maritime archaeology is: the wreck, the diver, the clear blue water. But in fact, it's much broader. So maritime archaeology is the scientific study of material remains of humans and their activities at sea, the related objects on the shore, and coastal communities. It also has a very social dynamic. We look at shipwrecks, maritime ethnographies, landscapes and seascapes and how they change, sea level rise and coastal dynamics, obviously a very important one at the moment, harbours and waterfronts, maritime cultures, and the protection of these underwater cultural pieces of heritage and the legislation that goes with it. Ooh, oh, here we go. So I'm going to give you a little taster of what we do with prehistoric landscapes first. So as you can see, we're looking at the continental shelf. I wonder whether we can do it again because it went so fast. Yeah, the continental shelf, and the sea levels rose during the Holocene. You can see that that area flooded. So these are areas that we're actually looking for human activity in prehistory. We can also do other work in these areas, and we can look at, using geophysical and geotechnical data, we can look at the sub-bottom sediment, and we can do core analysis looking at pollen evidence, diatom, foraminiferous, plant macrofossils, mollusks, and we can also do isotopic work. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. Instead, what I really want to talk about is how people engaged with the sea. How we have a variety of perspectives and expectations and visions of the sea in the past and also today. And these are all overlain. For example, we can look at the marine landscape and the seascape and think of treasure and exploration and naval triumph. Or we can see it as a resource and think of the new lands and the economics which are associated with it. Other people traditionally have seen the sea as a barrier, as a natural perimeter. But also, it's a pathway, it connects areas, it connects continents. So it has these many different visions of it. So the development of the discipline in general, what is maritime archaeology, is very tied to the development of diving and working underwater, as would make sense. So from the standard diving dress of the 1830s to the development of scuba in the 1950s with a self-contained underwater lung, basically, we have a very large development of the work that was going on. And there are a few key figures within this that I wanted to point out. And there are more that will come during the talk, and many of which will be very well known to you all, I'm sure. So perhaps the most famous, of course, is Jacques-Yves Cousteau, who was a naval officer, a French naval officer, from 1910 to 1997. And he developed, alongside Émile Gagnan, he developed the scuba sets, which enabled this development of the discipline. And one of his first projects was in Gon Conglue, which was a mound of amphora, which he excavated. And this is possibly one of the first underwater archaeological excavations, although the procedures weren't quite as fine-grained as we would use today. So following on from his work, I guess some of the better projects and biggest and most well-known are those by George Bass in the 1960s, for example, the wreck of the Cape Caledonia, and also Frederic Dumas and Peter Throckmorton. I also wanted to throw in here Honor Frost, mainly because she's also female, like me, obviously. And I remember actually when I first started studying archaeology, I was told there were two types of archaeologists. There were the brainy professors who had beards on their faces, and then there were the Indiana Joneses who had they had hair on their chests. And so obviously Honor, being the very glamorous diver and the brilliant archaeologist that she is, doesn't fit into any of those categories. So I'm glad to see that. She was a Mediterranean diving pioneer and worked in the Levantine coast, studying the harbours there and harbour dynamics and development. And she died very recently, as you can see. So alongside the development of diving, and comes very closely tied with it, these very prestigious iconic ship finds. And I'm going to go through a few of them now, and it will help put things in context a little bit. So I'm sure, again, many of these are very well known to you. At the top, of course, you can see the Mary Rose herself, 1540s. And this image here you'll see again later in the talk, but it's on the manuscript of Anthony, which is in the Pepys Roll in Magdalen Library, Cambridge. So alongside, of course, the Mary Rose, the Tudor warship, we have the Bronze Age wreck of the Cape Caledonia, which was found in Turkey, which was found by George Bass and worked on by Bass. We have 5 Viking ships at Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, worked on by Olaf Olsen and Ole Kremlin Pedersen, who died recently as well, I'm afraid. The 1628 Swedish warship, the Vasa, which is found in Stockholm Harbour, and I'm going to talk about that again a little bit later as well. and the VOC Batavia, which is found in Australia and worked on by Jeremy Green. And later, of course, fits into this trajectory is the RMS Titanic, which was excavated by Bob Ballard in 1985. And the ones starred, you can see, have been marked as they sank on the maiden voyages. We also can see some ideological parallels between some of these ships, and these are the links I'm going to draw out later in the talk to try and understand how ships are also symbols, and these symbols could be negotiated by communities and by society to reflect specific things. But, of course, technology has come a long way since the early days of underwater archaeology. So we initially had those images of Cousteau and Honor. But we can do many different things now. And one of the ways we've developed is being able to work at much greater depths. So deep archaeology is a growing subdiscipline. And here we go. We can see here the work done, which was a combination by MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and also the University of Southampton itself. And this is on the Skirky Bank, west of Sicily. It's in about 800 meters of water. And they found, amongst other things, 5 Roman merchantmen which had their cargo as well of amphora and other goods that were being transported between Northern Africa and Italy. You can see here the ROV Jason, which I think is one of the forefathers of the ROV Isis, which is here actually at the NAC, and also the nuclear submarine NR1, which was used in this project. So really, we're using cutting-edge technology. Also, we can work in shallow water and a little bit more locally. This is the River Hamble, for those of you who might recognise it. And this is where we found evidence of the Grace Dieu, which was the 1439 Henry V's flagship, which was left here after it had done its duty, and it eventually caught fire. And we knew roughly where it was, but we had to do some geophysics to find it. And we did various things, including sub-bottom profiling. And you can see here the trace of the hull, the amazing computer technology. And from that, we could begin to reconstruct what the hull would have looked like. We used a 3D acoustic sub-bottom chirp, which is a brand new system developed here at Southampton, also in the NOC, with colleagues Ruth Pletz, John Adams, and Justin Dix. So in collaboration with the Wolfson unit in ship science, we took this 3D image of the bottom of the hull, and we were able to create from that the ship lines that it would have originally, the original ship lines that would have had to have been the case from this 3D hull shape. So we are able to start reconstructing ships from very little analysis. And this all comes from sub-bottom survey. It doesn't come from excavation at all. So why is seafaring and its development so important? Well, boats and ships have played an important role in our past, from the very small scale, that of just a mode of transport, water transport, and for fishing activities and communication and things like that, to the global scale, from hominid migrations to more recent colonizations, trade and exchange, to global commerce and empire building, and of course also to defence and warfare and political legitimization. And I can only use as an example today that of HMS Dauntless heading off to the Falklands. It's very much there as a symbol of power and British interest. So boats and ships were often the most sophisticated expression of technology that society achieved. And in pre-industrial society, from the Upper Paleolithic to the 19th century AD, a boat, and later ships, were the largest and most complex machines produced. But actually, that's not just in the 19th century. I would add to McElroy's statement there that it's also true today. And if we look at nuclear submarines, you can also see them as very complex machines, and they take a lot of resources and finances as well as the technical knowledge. So actually, this is a continuation. So where did it all begin? And this is where I'm going to try and cover very briefly 800,000 years of seafaring, but I guess you're going to get just a few highlights. So to start with, we only have indirect evidence of seafaring. And one of those is the hominin migrations out of Africa. So it's a combination of knowing where the sea levels were to understand where places were islands and weren't connected to continents, and also then finding the fossils. So we have evidence of Homo erectus on Flores Island by 800,000 years BP. And Flores Island is, hold on, actually it's where the big red arrow is pointing, but it's there, I can point to it. And this would have involved crossing the Wallace Line, which is this one here, if you can see my arrow. So crossing the Wallace Line, and that's between two continents. This is the Sundar Shelf here, and this would have been Sahel here. So you're crossing between two continents. And in the past, this was a biogeographical boundary from between Bali and Lombok. It was around 20 to 30 kilometers of deep water channel, which wasn't crossed by any other mammals or land animals. It was very much a distinct area. And then suddenly we have Homo erectus in this area. So we've got a few questions, I guess. One, at that time period, was there a land bridge? Was it connected? Or did this in fact involve seafaring? I guess the second question is whether the bones and the artifacts are dated correctly and identified correctly. So there are a couple of issues. But then really we have nothing else for 750,000 years. And one has to wonder, really, does Homo erectus have seagoing ability? Because we really aren't seeing anything else. The next things we see at this point in this area are around 50 to 60,000 years ago. And that's the evidence for anatomically modern humans on the Australian continent, i.e. on the Sahel shelf, which is now Australia. And we've got several sites, and those dates are quite secure, and the archaeology is secure, and it definitely involved a water crossing. And there's two different crossings that might have been. One is the southern Birdsall and one's the northern route. So one might have been across from Timor down towards Darwin, and the other one would have gone through New Guinea. So we have these two possibilities. But either way, seafaring was involved. And actually not just a little hop, it would have been quite significant. And the number of people involved in this crossing would have had to be enough to have had a healthy population for populating Australia eventually. So it would have had to have been around 20 to 30 individuals. And so that's quite interesting. Breaking news, as of November 2011, so the end of last year, we found evidence, or colleagues obviously, found evidence on Timor itself, which is one of these possible routes into Australasia, around 42,000 years. So this fits into the picture okay, really. And the remains they had were pelagic fish, which are deep water fish, so not coastal fish. And also, and then a little bit later on the same site, fish hook manufacture, around 23 to 16,000 years ago. And so this is in the area. So we have an idea that for quite a long time we had maritime activity in this region. But of course, the evidence is very, very sparse. So we must be really careful not to draw too many conclusions and to make too large a picture from this tiny incident. And I guess when we're thinking about what kind of vessels they were going to be using in this period, one suggestion is a simple bamboo raft. And these can be quite stable, but obviously more work needs to be done, and there certainly is no evidence of the boat or boat types at this age. So hopping all the way back over to the Mediterranean, again we have some early evidence. Again, it's indirect evidence, and again, it's debated. So I'll give you a quick rundown of what we have. First of all, we have similar stone tool assemblages on both sides of the Mediterranean, including Acheulean cleaver flakes. We have dispersion of early sporadic finds from around 1 million years to 500,000 years ago in Spain and Italy, but not many other places. So in Spain, the site is Atapuerca, and in Italy, in Oceania. And of course, the argument is that because we have people on the North African coast, Ain Hanek in the Maghreb region, at 1.8 million years ago, it indicates that people were on the opposite coast, and perhaps it was easier to have crossed, or they crossed the channels either from the Straits of Gibraltar, which would have been very short distance at that time, or the Sicilian channels, which are much broader. However, again, we have no direct evidence of seafaring itself, and we know that that around this time, that from 5 million years onwards, after the Messinian salinity crisis, that the Straits of Gibraltar were open. And whilst it's difficult to reconstruct exactly the sea levels of the Mediterranean at the very early ages, we do know that these would have been water crossings. So there's so little evidence, I'm not sure what we can draw from that. We have more human claims for human presence on islands in the Mediterranean. Again, there are a few questions. Firstly, was it an island then? Secondly, are we looking at lithic artifacts? Are they real, or they're just geofacts, i.e. natural pieces of rock? So have they been knacked? Have they been created into tools? And once we have that information, we also need to know how secure the dating is and the context. So some of the areas that have been claimed to have human presence are the Lower Paleolithic on core Sardinia. So Corsica and Sardinia at that time would have been joined together and would have been one island. How close they were and how connected possibly to the Italian peninsula, we're not sure. Interestingly, there's also recently been evidence found on the Isle of Gavdos, which is just south of Crete, and on Crete itself, by 130,000 BP. That's about the lower to middle Paleolithic. However, again, I would refer you back to the original questions of whether these lithics that have been found are in fact artifacts, and also how secure the dating is. Because Crete was an island significantly far enough away from the mainland to have involved quite technical seafaring practices and significant boats at this period, which we have no other evidence for. So I'll keep my fingers crossed and hope that we might find something else, but at the moment I'm standing on the fence with that one. We also have some Middle Paleolithic on the Greek islands, the Sporades and Ionian islands, and Milos in the Cyclades. Also on the mainland in Thessaly, Albania and Dalmatia. But again, we have questions whether these islands were connected to the mainland. Later on in Cyprus, we have evidence from 11,000 to 10,000 BC. But the earliest evidence and first secure evidence for seafaring in the Mediterranean is that of the volcanic glass obsidian, which came from a volcanic source on Milos and was found in Frankthi Cave. And that definitely involved seafaring by 11,000 BC. So that's the earliest evidence for seafaring we have in the Med. So what kind of boats were these? And how were they made? Well, we have a few basic watercraft that we can look at. Few of them also used today, so we have some references. They're very simple, so we can start with things like floats and then rafts. These are often diverse, low investment, they're expedient, they have a short lifespan, and the buoyancy is from the materials used and the shape. These are different from boats, where the buoyancy comes from the displacement of water, and they therefore need to be watertight. Simple types of boat include bark boats, skin boats, basket boats, pot boats and log boats, and also extended log boats. But many of these aren't preserved or recognisable in the record. So here's a basic float. As you can see, this is an inflated oxhide from Kashmir. We have evidence of very, very similar floats being used in the past. We have all sorts of depictions, iconography, and carvings including these images. And these are still used today in some areas of India and China. So it's quite a widespread phenomenon. Incidentally, in India, they can cover the hide with a layer of bitumen, and they can also rub in some sort of pomegranate mixture, which is supposed to preserve the hide. So, who knows? I bet it doesn't smell that great. But anyway, moving on from the float, the basic log and reed boats. So a basic log boat, as you can see, don't need very much technology to make a basic log boat, and equally a reed boat as well. Some of the earliest include Mesolithic log boats, including one at Pesse, found in the Netherlands, dating to 6,315 BC. And this one here, the La Marmotta boat, which was found in Lake Bracciano in Italy, just slightly north of Rome, and this dates 5,700 BC. Rafts and bundle boats. Really, all you need to build a raft is some cordage to tie it all together, and I guess a sharp knife to cut the reeds, and of course some knowledge and skill. So they don't really need much infrastructure. And we've got examples of raft boats and bundle boats in history, including Jamaat Nazar, dating to 3,200 BC, on a Mesopotamian cylinder seal. Also, we see small ones here, which are ethnographic examples, but we have other ethnographic examples where they can be really quite large. And on the South American coast in the 18th century, they were from 80 to 25, 80 by 25 feet, so really, really large, and could be used for transporting cows and all sorts. So they can be quite significant pieces of technology and include quite significant investments of labour and time to build them. But when it comes to it, when we're looking at direct evidence as opposed to the indirect evidence, we don't really start to see stuff until the Neolithic. So in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, we're looking around 5,000 to 3,000 BC. And we see significant developments. And I'm not sure whether, partly in the Near East and in the Gulf region, whether this is because of the preservational conditions, because it's very dry, or whether this was an area where boats actually were developed and designed and seafaring started to flourish much earlier. So we can see here some of the first direct evidence from Kuwait, from Asubaya, from 5,500 to 5,000 years BC. And this is from a colleague, Rob Carter. And he found not only the boat model that you can see up on the left there, but also the little ceramic tablet or disc there on the right as well, which shows possibly two uprights which might have been a double mast, we're not sure, which is also particularly interesting in terms of propulsion. And on the right there, you can see it's an imprint of the bundle reeds, and on one side they also had traces of bitumen and also the barnacles attached them, so they were actually used. When it comes to larger boat remains, I guess one of the earliest is Abydos in Egypt, just south of Cairo, and these date to 3000 BC. You can see them on the bottom right. And there were several of these boats, so log boats again, and these were found in a funerary ritual context. And equally, and this is where boats begin suddenly to look like proper ships that you would recognise today, we have the Royal Cheops ship, which was found in 1954 even, besides the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. Again, it was found in a funerary deposit, and it's the first plank-built boat, and it dates to 2,600 years BC. So we're seeing ritual deposition quite early, and high symbolic profiles of the ship within society. And I'd also note that with the Cheops ship, because you're now into the Bronze Age, with the advent of metal, you also have this ability to create planking. So plank technology develops, therefore the boats you can build develop, they can get larger and get more complex. So they go in hand with social development and technological development. As for propulsion, obviously paddling and rowing are the simplest, but when did sailing originate? It used to be thought that the first evidence for sail is this depiction here on the Nakada vase, which dates to the Gursian period, so 3100 BC, and it's found in Egypt. And it was initially put forward that sailing developed in Egypt, where the winds go in one direction and the current of the river goes in the other. So what you can do is you can sail upstream, because you get the winds upstream, and then you take your sail down and you float back down the river once you're done, which helped the economics and development on the Nile in the Nile area to enable the commercial development of in Egypt. And perhaps these first sails were merely just palms that were put up, palm leaves and things that helped capture the wind, and this developed from there. And whether this is just a nice story that's used to tell the development of the sail, or whether there's any truth in it, I'm afraid I don't know. But recently, of course, we've got those early developments found by Rob Carter in the Gulf, and with that image with the double mast, possible double mast, that might be the earliest evidence of sailing, which takes us back another 2,000 years. So that could be really significant, and more work needs to be undertaken. So as we go on fully into the Bronze Age, we suddenly see this real fluorescence of boat technology. They get larger and larger and more complicated. They're used for trade and exchange. They become very important to society. And of course, we know this from all the iconography that's available in Egypt and elsewhere. And by the late Bronze Age, we can see quite large merchantman vessels which are travelling round the Mediterranean. And we can see from this example, this is the Uluburun, which is a 14th century wreck that was found off Kaş in southern Turkey, that it had goods on it which spanned the whole of that eastern Mediterranean region. So it had glass from Egypt, it had ceramics, and it had all sorts. It has all sorts of copper oxide ingots and stone tools and bones and all sorts of things. But really, it had been used in that Eastern European area, and it had circled around, and we could see that it was a trade ship. And therefore, we can take from this evidence that trade was quite well developed by the 14th century BC. This wreck here was excavated by Kamal Pulak in 10 years from 84 to 94, and in this time he carried out over 22,000 dives, which equates quite nicely actually with the Mary Rose, and I think they undertook something like 30,000 dives. So you can suddenly see how much work goes into excavating these wrecks. So that takes us up really to the Bronze Age, and then suddenly seafaring is so large, it's so important to so many different societies that I thought I'd take you away from that now, because I can't cover every single wreck, but cover a little bit about what shipping meant, what seafaring meant, and the symbolism, identity, and power that are connected to it. So we aren't only interested in documenting developing technology and technological change, but also what this technological change can tell us about the society who created it. Archaeology isn't only interested in material culture, but the people behind it. And ships and sea power can facilitate and support empire formation, from the Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Greeks and Romans to the Dutch VOC and, of course, the British. But they're also symbols of identity, power, and society, and the way it really is, and also the way it's been chosen to be represented. So here you can see a couple of images, and first is a simple boat from India, and of course it's been painted and decorated. It's showing identity, and it's showing that it's more than its technological parts. And this painting and decorating of vessels can come out in many ways, and obviously on the right there you can see the carving of the vasa. But also, in thinking about symbolism and identity, I thought I'd show you that top image, which is this naval supremacy of Zheng He and his ship in the early 1400s, and just the sheer size of it against the model there, which is the HMS Victory. you can really see the import of sea power and the what he wanted to show and the image he wanted to give off of his empire by the construction of a ship like that. So the Vasa. Now, I was interested in looking at the Vasa, not only because she sank on her maiden voyage, and of course we're here today partly because of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of Titanic, who also sank on her maiden voyage, but also because I wanted to explore a little bit of this dynamic about how a ship can be a symbol and how it can be represented both at the time it was built as something more than just a technological artifact, but a social symbol to indicate status and society, and perhaps to reflect a microcosm of society. But also because the Vasa itself is linked ideologically in many ways to the Mary Rose, which is round the corner, and therefore many people will have seen it. So the Vasa was a Swedish warship dating to 1628, and it was built with the intention to express the expansionist aspirations of Sweden and to glorify King Gustavus Adolphus. So no expense was spared in decorating and equipping the Vasa, which was also one of the largest and most heavily armed warships of its time. I'd like to bring out some of these familiar themes. So with the Titanic, obviously it was one of the largest of its time. It was very important. There was no expense spared. So these things are sort of drawing together and reflecting through history. This image here is the starboard cat head of the warship Vasa, and the wooden sculpture beneath the cat head is thought to represent an enemy, in this case a Pole apparently, a Polish nobleman hiding under a table, and it's supposed to be the dominion of Sweden over its enemies. The Vasa today is still very important. It's very significant to identity, Swedish identity, and it's because it symbolises Sweden's era of great power. This is when Sweden was at the centre, most important within Scandinavia. And as such, it's important national identity today. And you can see this by, in part by the museum and the gift shop and the number of artefacts that are constantly on sale. And we can see this again actually reflected with the Mary Rose. The Mary Rose has become such a figurehead within our society. And so here we have them together, the Vasa, the Mary Rose and the Titanic, just as examples of these iconic ships. So the Mary Rose in the middle there, King Henry VIII's flagship, royal Tudor power signified very strong. It was about statehood, and it was really a floating castle, as in many ways so was the Vasa. And because during the medieval period the castle was an expression of power, really set in stone quite literally, but these ships were floating castles, they were mobile propaganda. They could take the message of King Henry VIII and British power overseas to other people. You can see on this image here, again this is the Antony manuscript, the Antony roll, and you can see it here, it sails with heraldic devices, and it's used to express lineage and legitimization of new dynastic power, both the Vasa and the Mary Rose. Titanic is a little bit different. However, it's still true to say that perhaps the organization, internal compartmentalism, access and decoration all reflect ideology and society of the time. I just wanted to point out on the top left there as well, we have the image of the Mary Rose at the moment, as is being preserved at the Mary Rose Trust, and it's being sprayed by polyethylene glycol, or PEG, to conserve it. And what that does is it replaces the water in the cell structure of the timbers with a wax, basically wax. So you're turning it into a waxwork. And there are a couple of reasons why this is supposedly a good way to conserve it, because it stops when you dry wood and it just conflates and it dries and cracks and splits. That's because the cell structure is all collapsing. But if you fill it with this wax, it doesn't, and it holds its shape. And we very much took this process and conservation idea from that of the Vasa itself, which was the first major shipwreck to be excavated and preserved and conserved, and is in the Vasa Museum in Stockholm. And so we're doing very similar things. But anyway, getting back to ideology and society, and thinking about the Titanic a little bit more now. So here we have the Titanic departing Southampton on April the 10th, 1912, on its ill-fated maiden voyage, which ended 5 days later in the mid-Atlantic. And we have to remember that in the heyday, the British Empire started and ended in this very city. And the Titanic was a pin-up of the most advanced technologies and engineering in the empire. So very much like the Mary Rose was a pin-up of advanced technologies, the number of cannons she could hold and her design, and as was the Vasa. The Titanic is very similar. Her construction and division within reflected social divisions. And she was also set to change the face of transatlantic travel, reflecting how society wanted to be represented, modern, developing, highly technical, and not reflecting the unemployment, poverty, and the coal strikes that were going on at the time here in Britain, and specifically in Southampton. So very much a social strategy. And here, obviously, when the Titanic sank, it was reproduced, many reproductions of it. And we can see here an initial painting by Stuart, who is 1864 to 1931, very dramatic, romantic landscape painting and lots of action. And then the much stiller, quieter image of the RMS Titanic, photographed in 2004 by the ROV Hercules. So different images and representations of it, because the Titanic's really captured the world's imagination, and it was rapidly created into a kind of mythology that we see both very soon after it sank, but also more recently with the Hollywood movies and James Cameron's work. So the romanticized myth sprang up rapidly on both sides of the Atlantic, and maybe this was to extract meaning from the disaster and to emphasize the heroic nature of the first-class passengers conducting people off the vessel, but also reflecting and reconstructing contemporary notions of patriotism, class, and gender hierarchies. Here you can see a few. You can see on the right, this is one of the murals in Belfast where the ship was built. And Belfast has many memorials to it, many more than Southampton. But also more broadly, there's a lot of material that you can find on the Titanic. Obviously, a quick search can show you from the kitsch, this little ship and the bottle here on the top left, to the slightly more unusual, the songbook, a Yiddish songbook of the Titanic disaster, which was published in New York. So that's an interesting development, but as you can see, it meant a lot, and it became part of this big story quite rapidly. In most places. It didn't, however, here in Southampton. In Southampton, the sinking of the Titanic was just devastating. It was very simple, but it was devastating. It was none of the hype, none of the heroism. The story was much more local. It was much more on the doorstep and direct. And the reason for this is that the majority of the 900 crew lived here, and out of them, 700 died. And this had an immense impact on the city, because hundreds of families were left without primary breadwinners, the women were widowed, and the children were left orphaned, fatherless. It was a real tragedy in particular communities that had sprung up, connected to shipbuilding and seafaring, and with workers within those areas. And Northam is one of them, just round the corner. And in Northam, 1 in 4 houses lost a family member. So there was no getting away from it. And these families were thrown into poverty, and it was very personal and also a very commercial tragedy here, because the city was based on shipping, and it didn't want to focus on a tragedy, on a disaster. For these people, the stratified class system, the upclass, women and children first mottos and mythologies basically they were condemning and eliminating the crew from the picture, from the story. So this is how the past can be negotiated and represented again in the present at various times since the event. And obviously today things are a little bit different. And so today, because of demographic movement, many people actually associated with the Titanic are no longer here. So we're beginning to remember and to move slightly away from the personal histories and back into that more global narrative of the Titanic and the mythology that surrounded it. But initially that wasn't the case. And you can see here the memorial for the engineers of the RMS Titanic. And we had a couple of memorials, but they were very personal at the local level, and they celebrated people who did their duty. They weren't celebrating people who did exceptional duties, just the everyman and the crew members. And actually this was really one of the first times these memorials could be seen in Britain. And they had people listed by name, not by rank, not by position or social class, but just by name. And this really became the norm after the First World War, and memorizing the First World War. So these memorials were statues, were precursors really to that. And that's quite interesting. And actually, we have the new museum, the City Museum, that's just opening here, which has a lot of Titanic memorabilia and information in it. But we don't have very much else. There's no real Titanic walk, or there's no theme park and things like that. And that's what you would see, or you do see in some of the other cities which have connections with the Titanic. So not only are ships symbols in the past, but they're also symbols today. We rehistoricize them, we anthropomorphize them, and we also have nostalgia for them. As complex technologies, ships are one of the few pieces of technology that are given names. I can't think really of many others. We don't often all give names to cars, for example, but generally ships are all given names. Ships are also gendered, and this has been really since the medieval period. They've been seen to be female. Although Chris Tilley has argued from the Bronze Age Scandinavian records that he thinks that in Bronze Age Scandinavia they were male, but anyway, that's debatable. And also then we can think of ships as having lives, so we gender them, we give them names, and we give them biographies. And the 18th century engravings by Stuart van der Meulen include 16 prints of the biography of the ship, and he starts with the ship as an embryo in the womb of the dockyard being built, followed by its birth as it is launched down the ramp, down the slipway, and its naming. Then it's nurtured in the dockyard, where it's painted and it's provisioned. And then it leaves home, it goes off, it leaves the home port, it goes on a voyage of discovery. It goes through life, it has life's trials, for example, storms. It might have damage where it needs to be repaired. If there's a major accident, it might cut short the life of the ship through a wrecking incident. But otherwise, it'll be retired and it may end up in a breaker's yard. Eventually, it may then bequeath its heartwood to the building of a new ship and sometimes pass on its name. So we can see this echoing or reflecting of the biography of the ship. And this isn't so strange, really, actually, when we think about the way we deal with ships, and have done for quite a long time in the past. And one example of this, perhaps, is the ritual deposition, this synonymous relationship between life and death and boats. Quite often in a lot of narratives, the antecedents come to an island by boat. People, when they leave life, they go by boat. They pay the ferryman on the River Styx, for example. We also can see boats in funerary contexts, for example, the Cheops ship and also Saturn Hu, but there are many, many more, especially in Scandinavia. We can also see, if you're going to think, well, that's in the past, but what about today? We wouldn't do that today. Well, actually, back in 1949, when the Royal Navy's ship Implacable needed to be scuttled and needed to be got rid of, and they took it out into the channel, they put explosives on it, It took quite a long time. It didn't want to go down. People got very emotional. Eventually it did, and they gave it a gunnery salute, and the bugle played the last post. After that incident, the Maritime Museum in Greenwich said, "Oh, we never want to see that again. That was far too emotional." And obviously now we have HMS Victory, and it's sat there next to the Mary Rose. And we also have the museum itself with other memorabilia and things like that. So they didn't really want to scuttle it. It had become emotional. It had been tied to these narratives. So perhaps it's the reason that the ships are so important. They have these biographies, that they're so tied to these issues of nostalgia, myths and legends, and we do really get involved with them. And they play a part in society and also in local communities throughout time. So how do we protect ships? And how can we protect the cultural heritage against modern day challenges and threats? And I am just finishing up now. And just really, I don't want to leave on a negative point, but it's a real battle, especially today with the development in marine geophysics equipment. And the cost of this equipment means that it's quite hard, quite often, for academics and institutions to do the work they need to do. But there are companies that are set up which have funding, and all they're interested in is loot and treasure. And these treasure hunting companies are really battling us at every turn, and that's quite a problem. And I could go on at great length about the UNESCO protection of cultural heritage and why everyone should sign it, but for today I probably will leave it to that. We also have environmental challenges, of course, with rising sea levels and dynamic coastlines, and also coastal development. And this is particularly important in the Gulf region, where we have some of those really early seafaring finds that I showed you earlier. And when you look at the bottom right there, and you can see the Palm and the World and the massive development that's going on in UAE, in Bahrain, for example, and also Oman, really we need to act now to start surveying and conserving and preserving this maritime heritage for the future. And so this is very much tied into cultural, political priorities and how we can present the past and how it's perceived. So I think, yeah, that just is it. So thank you very much. Oh, different field.
Yeah, question back.
It's not a question, Helen, it's a comment.
Oh, gosh.
The business of ships having a personality, having a character, when you, it really isn't, to me, is never, speaking of somebody who's born next to the sea, it's no wonder really, because when you're a sailor, the ship is bearing you, it's your faith in getting home again. So I think that also might play a big part in the way people think about ships and why we do have this reverence, if you like, for them, and need to put them on a pedestal.
Yes, I agree, and I think you only have to see when Ellen MacArthur came back on Kingfisher, how attached she was to it, and she was kissing it and she wouldn't leave it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
I stayed in Malacca for a couple of years, and I was quite impressed by the building of the artificial islands, fishing islands.
Yes.
Some of them were very extensive, and I just wondered whether they might be involved in some of these links in the Far East between one island and another.
Yeah, that's quite possible. It is quite possible. I guess in some ways those early links are so early. We're not sure really what other technologies they have, because, but yes, absolutely, fishing very much tied to development of seafaring. Yeah.
Any more questions?
How helpful were expeditions like Kon-Tiki and Ra from an archaeological perspective?
Oh, good question. Well, there's been lots of debate. Personally, I find them quite useful. I think it is quite interesting to see, not perhaps for the same reasons. So I don't necessarily think that the ships would necessarily have looked like that, or the journeys they took would have been exactly those journeys. So I don't necessarily agree with those early dates for the trans-Pacific or transatlantic crossings. But, however, when you're looking at the time and effort it takes to build a boat out of reeds, bundle reed boat, the quantity that you would need, the tools you would need. Well, as soon as you start looking at things like that, it becomes really, really interesting. And not only technology, but the social skills as well. So would there have to have had to be social organisation? What sort of navigational knowledge would you need? Would there be a hierarchy on board ship? All those questions are really important, because actually, when you're looking at early society, you don't necessarily see that on land. And with the production of the things that are conserved and preserved on land, for example, the stone tools, and items like that, it's very hard to get to some of those questions. And I think that through these complex technologies, we can begin to address some of those. So yeah, I think it is quite useful. Yeah.
Any more questions? I have a question, Helen. What are you working on at the moment? What's your kind of research area?
So for my Leverhulme research, I'm doing something totally different. I'm working here in the Solent, and I'm looking at the relationship between humans and sea level rise in the Solent region during the Holocene, so 10,000 years. So it's very much a geoarchaeological submerged landscapes project. But I'm writing proposals and things to go off and combine the skills of these environmental paleo landscape modelling practices with the early seafaring to go off and look at the Sundar-Sahul connectivity, specifically between Timor and Darwin. So, yeah, that's the next step.
Sounds like another talk to me.
Do we have any final questions for Helen? No? In that case, thank you for coming. Thank you very much for your talk. It was brilliant. Before everybody goes, the talk next month will be more of a fleet. We'll be talking about solar aliens.